The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the largest and most terrible fights in all of human history. It began in the summer of 1942, specifically on the 23rd of August, when German forces started their major push into the city. The battle would rage on for over 5 months, through the freezing Russian winter, finally ending on the 2nd of February, 1943. This epic struggle took place in and around the city of Stalingrad, which is located in southern Russia, stretching along the western bank of the wide Volga River. Today, this city is known as Volgograd, but its name during the war carried immense symbolic weight, a fact that was not lost on the leaders of either side who were about to commit millions of soldiers to its fate. The city of Stalingrad was incredibly important to both Germany and the Soviet Union, but for different reasons. For the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, the city was named after him, making its defense a matter of personal and national pride. Losing it would be a huge blow to Soviet morale. More practically, Stalingrad was a major industrial center, producing tanks and other war materials. It was also a critical transportation hub on the Volga River, which was a vital route for supplies and oil from the Caucasus region to the rest of the Soviet Union. Holding the city meant keeping this crucial supply line open and functioning. For Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, capturing Stalingrad was a key objective of their 1942 summer campaign, codenamed Case Blue. The primary goal was to secure the rich oil fields of the Caucasus to the south. Taking Stalingrad would protect the northern flank of this German advance. It would also cut the Soviet Union's vital Volga artery, crippling their ability to move resources and potentially forcing them to surrender. Furthermore, Hitler, much like Stalin, saw the immense propaganda value in capturing the city that bore his enemy's name. It would be a powerful symbol of German victory and Soviet collapse for the entire world to see. The two main sides in this monumental conflict were the Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. The German forces were primarily represented by their highly experienced and powerful Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus. They were supported by armies from Germany's allies, including Italy, Romania, and Hungary. The Sixth Army had a formidable reputation and had been instrumental in the early German victories of the war. On the other side stood the Soviet Red Army. The forces defending the city itself were part of the 62nd Army, led by the determined General Vasily Chuikov, whose orders were to hold the city at all costs. The fighting in Stalingrad was unlike anything seen before. It was a new kind of warfare, fought street by street, house by house, and even room by room. After an intense bombing campaign by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, much of the city was turned into a sea of rubble and twisted steel. These ruins, however, did not make the city easier to capture. Instead, the bombed-out factories, apartment blocks, and piles of debris created a perfect defensive landscape for the Soviet soldiers. They turned every ruin into a fortress with hidden machine gun nests, sniper positions, and anti-tank rifle teams waiting in ambush. The Germans called this type of close-quarters combat Rattenkrieg, or Rat War. General Chuikov's strategy was to hug the enemy. He ordered his soldiers to stay as close to the German lines as possible, often just a grenade's throw away. This tactic had a very specific purpose. It made it extremely difficult for the German Luftwaffe to bomb Soviet positions without also hitting their own men. This forced the battle into a grinding, infantry-focused struggle where the Germans' superiority in air power and tanks was less effective. Soldiers fought with rifles, submachine guns, grenades, and sharpened shovels in the dark, smoky ruins. Famous locations like the Red October Tractor Factory and the Barricadi Gun Factory became self-contained battlefields where fighting raged for months. The suffering of both soldiers and civilians during the battle was immense and almost beyond description. For the soldiers, life was a constant state of terror, exhaustion, and hunger. The ever-present threat of sniper fire meant that any movement in the open could be deadly. Food and ammunition were always in short supply, especially for the Soviet defenders who relied on dangerous boat crossings over the Volga River, often under heavy German fire. Medical care was basic at best, and many wounded soldiers died from their injuries in the rubble. The psychological toll was just as severe, with the constant noise of battle and the sight of death all around pushing men to their absolute limits. Civilians who were trapped in the city faced an unimaginable nightmare. Many were unable to evacuate before the German advance and were caught in the crossfire. They hid in cellars and basements, trying to survive the constant shelling and bombing. Starvation was a constant threat, as food supplies ran out completely. People were forced to eat anything they could find, from pets to boiled leather. There was no clean water, no electricity, and no heat as the brutal Russian winter set in. Tens of thousands of civilians died from bombing, starvation, disease, and the freezing cold, their suffering a tragic and often overlooked part of the story of Stalingrad. While the German Sixth Army was being slowly bled dry in the grinding street fighting inside Stalingrad, the Soviet High Command was busy planning a massive counterattack. The German focus on capturing the city itself had left their flanks, which stretched for hundreds of kilometers across the open steppe, dangerously exposed. These flanks were largely held not by elite German troops, but by their less well-equipped and less motivated Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian allies. The Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov developed a brilliant and ambitious plan to exploit this weakness. The plan was given the code name Operation Uranus, and its goal was nothing less than the complete encirclement of the German forces at Stalingrad. On the 19th of November, 1942, the Soviets launched their massive counteroffensive. In the freezing fog and snow of the early winter, huge Soviet armies crashed into the weak Romanian positions to the north and south of Stalingrad. The Romanian soldiers, who lacked sufficient anti-tank weapons and were stretched thin, were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer power of the Soviet assault, which was led by hundreds of T-34 tanks. Their lines collapsed almost immediately. The Soviet armored spearheads punched through the defenses and raced across the frozen plains, their objective being to meet up at the town of Kalak-na-Donu, far to the west of Stalingrad, effectively trapping the entire German Sixth Army. The German commanders, including General Paulus, were caught completely by surprise. They had been so focused on the battle within the city that they had underestimated the Red Army's ability to launch such a large-scale operation. Within just 4 days, the trap was sprung. On November 23rd, the Soviet forces from the north and south met at Kalak, snapping the ring shut. The German Sixth Army, along with parts of the 4th Panzer Army, a force of nearly 300,000 men, was now completely surrounded. Their supply lines were cut, and they were trapped in a vast pocket of land known as the Kessel or Cauldron, with the ruined city of Stalingrad at its center. Hitler forbade General Paulus from attempting to break out of the encirclement. He was assured by Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, that the trapped army could be supplied entirely by air. This promised air bridge was a complete failure. The Luftwaffe did not have enough transport planes, and the ones they did have were vulnerable to Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns. They could only deliver a small fraction of the food, fuel, and ammunition that the Sixth Army needed to survive, let alone fight. The promise of rescue from the air turned into a slow death sentence for the soldiers trapped in the pocket. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, conditions for the trapped German soldiers deteriorated rapidly as the Russian winter tightened its icy grip. Temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius and below. The soldiers lacked proper winter clothing and slowly began to starve on the meager rations delivered by the failed airlift. Frostbite, disease, and malnutrition became as deadly as the Soviet bullets and shells. The once proud Sixth Army was reduced to a freezing, starving mass of men huddled in trenches and basements, their strength fading with each passing day. A German relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, was launched in December, but was fought to a standstill and failed to break through the Soviet ring. Faced with this hopeless situation, the Soviet command offered General Paulus terms of surrender in early January 1943. Hitler, from his headquarters far away in Germany, absolutely forbade it. He demanded that the Sixth Army fight to the last man and the last bullet, seeing their sacrifice as a heroic and symbolic stand. He even promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, a subtle and cruel reminder that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Despite these orders from a distant leader, the reality on the ground was one of complete collapse. The remaining German forces were exhausted, out of ammunition, and physically unable to continue the fight against renewed Soviet attacks. By the end of January, the Soviet forces had split the Stalingrad pocket into 2 smaller, more manageable parts. On January 31st, 1943, a starving and defeated Field Marshal Paulus surrendered the southern pocket from his headquarters in the basement of a department store. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the last remaining German troops in the northern pocket also laid down their arms. The battle was over, Of the nearly 300,000 men who had been trapped, only around 91,000 were left to surrender. The rest had died in combat or from starvation and cold. The city of Stalingrad was a wasteland, completely destroyed, but it had been held. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad is widely considered the single most important turning point of World War II in Europe. The catastrophic defeat of the Sixth Army was a blow from which the German military never fully recovered. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and marked the end of their advances into the Soviet Union. From this point forward, the Red Army would be on the offensive, beginning the long and bloody push that would eventually end in Berlin 2 years later. The battle demonstrated the incredible resilience of the Soviet people and provided a massive boost to Allied morale around the world, signaling that Hitler's defeat was not just possible, but inevitable.